Welcome back. This is the third installment, or the third video, on the set of PowerPoint notes that you have on the Pre Reformation. We've looked at John Wycliffe, the morning star of the Reformation. We've looked at Jan Hus, who in his being influenced by Wycliffe, he anticipated in many ways Martin Luther, as we saw. And in this particular portion of this particular video, what I want to do is talk about another movement that was really not so much pre-Reformation, but happening at the same time of the Reformation, but is important to our understanding before we get to the lectures on the Reformation, and that is the Renaissance. And so let me go ahead and pick it up there. One of the most important intellectual developments before the Reformation is the so-called Renaissance. We're going to learn that means rebirth, along with the rise of a part of, or an element of the Renaissance called Christian humanism. The Renaissance was a time of renewed interest in the study of the humanities, beginning in Italy, spreading throughout Europe in the 14th through the 16th century. The Renaissance brought a revival of art, and that's often what most people know about the Renaissance, because a lot of the art of the Renaissance, Michelangelo's David, or Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel at the Vatican, or Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, or the works of other Renaissance artists like Raphael and Donatello and others, and the period of the revival of literature under men like Petrarch and others. That's not what our course is about, but I'm just referencing them. It was a period, again, of a revival of learning and art, literature, learning, those things, that constituted a transition from the Middle Ages to the modern age. The widespread impact of the Renaissance affected Christianity and helped change the course of history, so that's why we're mentioning it. The intellectuals of the Renaissance, people again like Petrarch, who was the literary foundation of the Renaissance in many ways, thought that the classical learning of the Greeks, Plato, Aristotle, and we've already mentioned a number of times, and classic Latin writers like Cicero, who's the guy, by the way, that influenced Augustine, were superior to the scholastics of the Middle Ages. In other words, these guys, the Renaissance scholars, thought that the ancient writers were superior to the people that we've been looking at, people like Aquinas or William of Ockham, or any number of them. Indeed, they invented the term Middle Ages to suggest the time when the culture, arts, literature, and everything, rhetoric and sciences had declined, and they had been replaced with church dogma and narrow authoritarian thinking. In other words, they were saying the classic era, that was the high point, and everything since then has been sort of a low point. Indeed, it's to these guys that we owe the fact that we think of the Middle Ages as some time of an age of decline, or even the Dark Ages or something like that. I hope we've seen that nothing could be further from the truth. There was very high intellectual attainment, and sure, there were difficult times. We didn't talk about it because this isn't about history, but the Black Death rolled in the 14th century, and certainly the conditions of life were not very good during the Middle Ages in many, many ways. But in terms of what we're talking about here, in terms of intellectual attainment, in terms of scholarship, in terms of even the production of things like art and other sorts of things, we shouldn't let the writers of the Renaissance influence us in thinking that the Middle Ages was a dim time intellectually or artistically, or even in terms of literature. They basically were discounting and disparaging the Middle Ages because they wanted to go back to the kinds of things that they saw in classic literature. So that's fine if they want to do that, but don't disparage the Middle Ages in the meantime. Nevertheless, they saw themselves as reviving the classical mind and culture, and so they thought theirs was an age of rebirth. of Renaissance, as they called it. Their motto was ad fontes, which is a Latin expression, means return to the sources or back to the fount, literally, simply to the sources. It reflected a renewed interest again in Greek and Latin classics. Now, in a way, by the way, the reformers were to pick up on that idea. They wanted to return to the scriptures, and so they wanted to have new translations of the Greek and Hebrew Bible into the vernacular languages of the people. So there's a little bit of overlap there, but we should recognize that in many ways, the Reformation and the Renaissance were pretty different kinds of movements. And by the way, in your slide there's a picture of the skyline, Brunelleschi's dome over the cathedral in Florence and the bell tower in Florence, very famous piece of Renaissance architecture. And Florence was basically the heart of the artistic side of the Renaissance, and there's a lot of really beautiful and important works of art there. Anyway, back to our study. In an effort to aid the shift from original sources, Erasmus of Rotterdam published a Greek New Testament in 1516 using the Greek manuscripts that he had available. This translation by Erasmus is very important and had a huge impact on the Reformation in the sense that now they went back to ad fontes, they went back to the sources, they went back to the original Greek. As we saw with Wycliffe, he translated the Bible from Vulgate, from Latin, into English, but now we will have scholars who want to make sure that, again, the Bible is translated into the vernacular of the various countries, Germany, France, England, English, and they have a tool to do that. They have Erasmus's Greek New Testament. Even though Erasmus's text was far from perfect, it was a vast improvement over Latin and a key to the rise of Christian humanism in the Renaissance. As the Bible was studied in the original languages, errors in the Latin translation were exposed, and Martin Luther discovered that where the Greek word has repent, Latin Vulgate had the words do penance. And so he recognized that the entire structure of the Roman Catholic system of confession and doing penance was based on a bad translation. It just means repent. It doesn't mean do Catholic penance or anything of the sort. The Renaissance spawned an intellectual movement called humanism. Humanism was initiated by secular men of letters rather than by scholar clerics who had dominated the medieval intellectual life and had developed scholastic philosophy. So what was happening at this time, in other words, is that men could be scholars, but not necessarily priests or monks or clerics, as we've seen a number of the examples going back over the last few lectures. The Renaissance promoted a rediscovery of classical philosophy, literature, and art, as we've said, and some of the greatest thinkers, authors, and statesmen, and scientists, and artists in human history thrived during this period. People, again, as we've said, like the artists Michelangelo or Raphael, Galileo in the sciences, and others. Once again, the point is that the Christian humanists were not necessarily clerics. They weren't necessarily attached to the church. They were scholars first and foremost, and many times only that. Humanism had several significant features. First, it took human nature and all of its various manifestations and achievements as its subject. In other words, it had a very optimistic view of man and his ability to think, write, produce good literature, good art, etc. It was very human-centered, obviously by the name. Second, it stressed the unity and compatibility of truth found in all philosophical and theological schools and systems, a doctrine known as syncretism. In other words, the Renaissance scholars, because they were no longer necessarily attached to the church, could read Arabic scholars, for instance, and others, and put them on the same par as the scholars of the Middle Ages. Indeed, this is why they went back to people like Plato and Aristotle and other Greek scholars and Latin scholars, Latin philosophers like Cicero. They said we'll add them on the same level as the scholarship and the source of information as the Bible. It emphasized the dignity of man, again, something you can see from humanism. And finally, humanism looked forward to a rebirth of lost human spirit and wisdom. So it was very syncretistic, as that slide says, or eclectic. They brought information from anywhere and everywhere and gave all of it equal consideration. A number of Christian humanists, however, did not want to do away with the church. They wanted to reform it. This would be men like Thomas More in England or Erasmus of Rotterdam. You've seen Erasmus a couple of times before. They wanted to reform the church. They recognized the same kinds of things, same kinds of problems that the reformers did, the same kind of problems that Wycliffe and Huss had seen in the church. But they didn't want to overthrow the church. They wanted to reform it. They wanted to fix it. One of Erasmus's great works in this regard is titled "In Praise of Folly," in which he, in a satirical sort of way, poked fun at the foibles of the Catholic system. So whereas, for instance, Huss was preaching against these abuses, Erasmus wanted to just poke fun at it, and to mock it a little bit, and hopefully then others might decide that things needed to be improved. The northern humanists in Germany and England, the Netherlands in particular, made reform of the church their chief occupation. Many German, English, and other northern humanists saw no contradictions between Christianity and the study of ancient cultures, and like other humanists, as we just said, they believed they could be reconciled. But they wanted to do this all within the confines of the church. So in some ways, these Christian humanists had similar ideas and goals of the reformers. They wanted to reform the church. They wanted to fix things. And at first, they thought they were allies. In fact, when Luther posted his 95 Theses, when Erasmus heard about them and read them, he was very enthusiastically a supporter of Luther. Later, Luther and Erasmus became very strident antagonists with each other. And that's when it became clear that the Reformation was clearly not just a part of the Renaissance. They were two very different movements. So we can see that in some ways the Renaissance helped pave the way for the Reformation. Again, the Greek New Testament from Erasmus, for instance, or the idea of going back to the sources, not to Greek and Latin philosophers, but back to the original text of the Bible. So they had some very helpful things with respect to making it possible for the Reformation to happen. Well, we're ready now then with these pre-Reformation men, pre-reformers, and the understanding of the movement of the Renaissance, which happened at the same time as the Reformation. We're ready to move into the Reformation, which we will do in the next set of PowerPoints and the next set of lectures.